हेलो फ्रेंड्स, केजी क्लासेस में आपका स्वागत है। आज हम आपको मैथ्यू अर्नोल्ड के लॉन्ग आंसर के बारे में बताएंगे। क्वेश्चन, राइट ए नोट ऑन द क्रिटिकल अप्रिसिएशन ऑफ द सोनेट शेक्सपियर्स। हेडिंग है इंट्रोडक्शन। शेक्सपियर, वन ऑफ द मोस्ट फेमस सोनेट्स ऑफ अर्नोल्ड, occupies a remarkable place in English poetry. This sonnet was published in 1849 and its form is a mixture of Petrarchan and Shakespearean models. The first 8 lines form the octave and next 6 lines are divided into Shakespearean quatrain and the concluding couplet. It is essentially an objective work because the poet reveals no subjective thought in it. From the beginning, the poet is of the opinion that Shakespeare's personality was matchless. From the point of view of poetic style, it is certainly a great contribution of Arnold to the development of sonnet writing. The writers point out, other abide our question, thou art free, be asked and ask, thou smilest and art still out topping knowledge for the loftiest hill, who to the stars unknown his majesty. Heading is the theme. The theme of this sonnet is the greatness of William Shakespeare, who achieved a wonderful success in literature as a dramatist and as a poet. Shakespeare's drama as well as his sonnets have earned the greatest fame for him, and at present no other dramatist can be compared with him. Arnold tries to reveal the place of Shakespeare in literature and points out that Shakespeare is so much supreme and his place is so much high that no dramatist can touch his high and his depth. Thus, Shakespeare's greatest opinion has been uncertained by the poet in this sonnet. This is the only theme which has been developed by the poet in this sonnet. For the loftiest hill, who to the stars unknown his majesty, placing his steadfast footsteps in the sea. Heading a tribute to Shakespeare. The sonnet Shakespeare is the best tribute to the great dramatist Shakespeare. Arnold comments in it that all other poets and the writers are the subject of our critical question, but Shakespeare is free from them. The poet compares the great personality of Shakespeare with a great mountain whose peak touches the starry sky and whose roots are fixed at the bottom of the sea. In the field of thought, Shakespeare is divine and worldly. He understood human life and its relationship with the supreme power. The poet also comments that the personality of Shakespeare was unique, but he did not seek support for his respect, education and fame. He was so much unique that he got all these things with his own efforts. The poet comments at last that Shakespeare was a great realist who painted the human life in his works. The poet remarks, self-schooled, self-scanned, self-honored, self-secure. Heading a poetic style. The poetic style of this sonnet is charming and impressive. The poet uses very forceful words to glorify the personality of William Shakespeare. He also uses figures of speech in order to express his thoughts. He compares Shakespeare with the great mountains, the roots of which are in the depth of the sea. As far as diction is concerned, it is very charming and appealing. It is a perfectly and objective work of Arnold, the writer point out. Planting his steer fast footsteps in the sea, making the heaven of heavens his dwelling place, is fierce but the border often of his ways to the felt searching of morality. Heading a conclusion. William Shakespeare, the greatest dramatist and the most outstanding poet, has been paid tribute by many poets and writers. Arnold has tried to pay the best tribute to the greatest personality of Shakespeare in this sonnet. The thoughts of the poet are unique and touching. He tries to reveal the real nature of his glory that came in his world, to give the message of God that this world is a stage and all the human beings are merely players in it. In this regard, the poet remarks, all pains the immortal sprite must endure, all weaknesses which impairs, all grief which woe, find their sole vice in that victorious brow. Next question is, write a note on Matthew Arnold as a poet, or what are the qualities of the poetry of Matthew Arnold? Answer. Introduction. Matthew Arnold has been considered as a remarkable poet as well as an important critic of his time. At present, he is respected more as a poet than as a critic. In his poetry, he reveals his certain view about human life and human suffering. These views put him in the line of Wordsworth, Shelley, Keats and Browning, who were poets as well as philosophers. He shows his great love for nature. That is why he has also been regarded as a nature poet. A famous critic, Arthur, points out that in his poetry Arnold presents himself as a critic of human life. The writer points out, some call him an educated versifier, Edith Sitwell, others a academic idiot. Some find him colorless. Hearns Arnold was not a poet but a man who wrote poetry, says Mary Coleridge. Sir Arthur Conan Coach thinks that he had not the bardic, the architectonic gift, that he was not a weird, not a muse-intoxicated man. Heading a melancholy poet. In English poetry, Arnold is often compared with Thomas Hardy because of his melancholy thoughts. The poet finds that human life is full of suffering without any clear case. He finds that because of many baseless ambitions, men suffer more and more. He also believes that death is the only fact of human life. He occupies an important place among the poets who have composed elegies. Theresis is one of the most remarkable elegies in English poetry. Besides it, there are many other poems in which he deals with the atmosphere of an elegy. Thus, the melancholy note is one of the most important features of the poetry of Arnold. At present, he is regarded as the most melancholy poet in English poetry. Writer points out, Arnold was perhaps conscious of his place when he said, it might fairly be argued that I have less poetic sentiments than Tennyson, and less intellectual vigor and abundance than Browning. Yet because I have more perhaps of a fusion of the two then, and have more regularly applied that fusion to the main line of modern development, I am likely enough to have my turn as they have had theirs. Heading as a poet of nature. The 19th century poetry is very rich in nature. Arnold worships nature like the Romantic poets. He turns to nature to learn the moral lesson. He does not worship nature as we find in the poetry of William Wordsworth, but in his poetry he presents his deep love for nature in his very poem, he points out that nature gives us the lesson of morality and it teaches us the proper way of human life. A critic compares him with Wordsworth and points out Arnold has Wordsworth's calm, but neither his cheerfulness nor his detachment. Heading as a philosopher. In his poetry, Arnold presents his opinions on man, nature, and human life. He is a critic of life not only in his poetry but also in his prose. He reveals moral analysis, philosophical vision, and the study of human behavior. These views determine his position as a philosopher. Among English poets, Dover Beach, Rugby Chapel, The Buried Life, and Resignation are some of those poems in which we find him almost as a philosopher. For example, in the following lines, the Dover Beach was observe his philosophy, and we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and fight. Adding the impact of romanticism. In Arnold poetry, we find that impact of romanticism, though he is not a romantic poet. For example, he loves melancholy and loneliness, and like a romantic poet, he shows his great relationship with nature. Beside it, he is a subjective poet, so these features of his poetry are the features of a romantic poet. In fact, in his poetry, there is a clear impact of the romantic poets. A critic point out, Arnold's verse shall continue to be read because of its inner romanticism. Having a poetic style. Arnold's poetry is of great importance because of his poetic style. Many times he takes the classical themes and presents it in modern dress. In other words, the poet deals with the classical theme and provides it with a modern language. Like William Wordsworth, he uses very simple language. He employs serious and impressive diction in his poetry. His expressions are very clear and generally in his poetry he reveals mastery in blank verse. This blank verse is so much outstanding in his poetry that no modern poet can be compared with him. But some critics think that Arnold does not love music. In spite of this defect, Arnold's poetry is of great importance from the points of view of his poetic style. A critic comments, Arnold's poetry has in a high degree the classic qualities of poise, temperance, and reserve. Careful workmanship and purity and dignity of style are among its permanent technical features. Though his ear was not perfect, his lyrical measures are generally satisfying, while his blank verse has a stately movement of its own. Having a conclusion. Thus, Matthew Arnold is a true poet because his poetry has imagination, emotion, wit, pathos, melancholy, his love for nature, and his philosophy of life. These features of his poetry puts him in the line of great romantic poets like Wordsworth, Shelley, and Keats, since his poetry is a criticism on man, nature, and human life. He proves to be one of the greatest thinkers among English poets. A famous critic, W. H. Hudson, pointed out, despite being a famous prose writer, Arnold showed the outstanding qualities of true poetry in his poems. Next question is discuss the melancholy of Arnold or discuss Arnold as an elegiac poet. Answer. Introduction. Matthew Arnold is one of the greatest elegiac poets in English poetry. The most important element in his poetry is the element of melancholy. Arnold belongs to the Victorian age, and fact is that in Victorian age there is no poet who can produce the depth of Arnold's melancholy. In his poetry, he often describes the dark side of human life. He points out that in many of his poems that human life is nothing but a tale of dreams. Many critics compares Arnold's melancholy with the melancholy of Keats. A famous critic, Garrod, points out, if I had to define Matthew Arnold's place in poetry, he is the greatest elegiac poet in our language. हेडिंग है एक poet of elegy. In the history of English poetry, we find many poets who have composed immortal elegies. Matthew Arnold is also one of those greatest poets like Milton, Gray, Shelley and Tennyson. Arnold also gives expression to his sorrow in his elegies. In his elegies, he is both a subjective and objective poet. In his elegies, he is highly matched his two famous poems. Thyrsis and Rugby Chapel can be out as proper example in this regard. In Thyrsis, the poet is certainly an objective poet, but in Rugby Chapel, he is a subjective poet because he laments the death of his father. But it does not mean that Thyrsis is completely an objective poem, because in Thyrsis the poet mourns the death of his friend Chloe. Indeed, in the field of elegies writing, he can be well compared with Milton, Gray, Shelley and Tennyson. In this regard, Garrod points out, in virtue of the whole temper, his genius was essentially elegiac, having the best kind of poetry. The elegies of Arnold are regarded as the best works of poet. His elegies are in the line of the elegies of Gray. Even the personal grief in his poetry is presented as a general grief. For example, Thyrsis is an elegy on the death of his friend Mr. Chloe. Rugby Chapel deals with the death of his father. Southern Night is another famous elegy in which he laments the death of his brother. Westminster Abbey, another famous elegy of Arnold, has been composed by him on the death of a famous personality, Stanley. Thus, almost all his famous elegies are the fine blendings of subjective and objective poetry. A writer points out, some call him an educated versifier, Edith Sitwell, others academic Eliot, some find him colorless hence. Arnold was not a poet but a man who wrote poetry, says Mary Coleridge. Sir Arthur Collier Coach thinks that he had not the bardic, the architectonic gift, but was not a bard, not a muse, intoxicated man. Heading his philosophy. Among English poets, Arnold has been regarded as a great philosopher. His philosophy presents the fact that human life is full of suffering, and everywhere in this world the crisis of pain and struggle can be heard. Like the romantic poet, Arnold also feels that suffering are the facts of life and man cannot escape from the suffering. The melancholy of Arnold becomes very outstanding when he presents any philosophical idea. For example, in the following lines, his melancholy as well as his philosophic outlook can be noted. Let us be true to one another, for the world which seems to lie before us like a land of dream. Heading a conclusion. This Arnold is a remarkable melancholy poet because his melancholy is not for the sake of melancholy, but it is for the sake of his philosophical outlook. It is fact that the element of melancholy comes from him through romantic poetry. At the same time, he makes a fine blending of romanticism and classicism in all his best poems. Dover Beach and Rugby Chapel are his two important elegiac poems because though the melancholy of his heart, the poet gives the message of morality. A famous critic calls him the best of our elegiac poets. A critic comments that Arnold was perhaps conscious of his place when he said, "It might fairly be argued that I have less poetic sentiments than Tennyson and class intellectual vigor and abundance than Browning. Yet because I have more perhaps of a fusion of the two than and have more regularly applied that fusion to the main line of modern development, I am likely enough to have my turn as they have had theirs. Thanks, best of luck."